So I want to go through some of this real quick, and I'll say something about the exam at the end. We've been thinking a lot and talking a lot about resistance. Obviously, that's really, in many ways, that's the entire theme of the class, is this question of resistance. I told you I won't teach you about slavery without teaching you about resistance. And you've heard me talk about slavery a lot. Right? It seems like we're constantly dealing with that because it's the constant in this whole entire period of African American history. It really, if you think about it, it doesn't end until this class ends. So if you felt like that's what we ended up talking about week after week after week, you're right. Right, in one way or another, it always came back to that. And I would argue that even at the end, right, even at the end of the this time period, we're still dealing with this. And in many ways, it's going to continue to affect the United States more generally. Obviously, it affects African Americans throughout their experience to 1865. It affects slave and free. It affects North and South and West. It affects everyone in one way or another.
Thanks.
So I want to talk about that in the end of the institution, how it's going to impact America more generally, while continuing to keep in mind this theme of resistance. Right? And that's where we have begun and where we end the class. This PowerPoint is online. It's listed as Chapter 9 from Slavery to Freedom. That doesn't correspond exactly with your textbook. That's more Chapter 6 of the textbook, which is where you were supposed to end at 6. So it really is about this theme of abolitionism, the end of the institution, and the coming of the Civil War. The end of slavery and the coming of the Civil War happened at the same time in American history and in African American history. They grow up together. They happen together. And so that's where I want to sort of end. Thinking about abolitionism in black and white. We turn this down so you can actually see the screen. Again, if you're not finished with that self-eval, you can do that sometime at the end. We talked about how abolitionism is becoming more militant in this antebellum period. Remember, antebellum really means the generation before the Civil War. So from about 1830 to 1860, we've talked about how in many ways this abolitionism is becoming more militant. African American abolitionists had in many ways always been militant, but even white abolitionists in this period are seeming to become more and more militant, trying to end the institution right away. We've seen some examples of that. A few more are listed here. David Walker, again, is one of the most militant people that we see in African American history. He's calling for immediate abolition. He's calling for slaves to be freed without compensation to their owners, which was radical. Some abolitionists were saying, okay, we'll free slaves, but we have to pay their owners because they are their property. David Walker says, no, this is illegitimate property. You get nothing for it, essentially. This is going to be, put him in the extreme, along with people like William Lloyd Garrison. William Lloyd Garrison is a white abolitionist in Boston who starts publishing the Liberator magazine in 1831. Extremely radical. He's the one that burns copies of the Constitution publicly, saying that it was a deal made with slaveholders and deal with the devil, essentially. And so, again, you think of this as a Southerner, a pro-slavery Southerner. You're hearing these voices coming from the North that sound like they're attacking you. You know how people always feel like they're the ones being persecuted, even when they're doing wrong, right? So pro-slavery Southerners are like, you Northerners are attacking us. They're feeling more and more defensive because of a David Walker, because of a William Lloyd Garrison in 1831, and because of Nat Turner. Nat Turner's rebellion also happens in 1831 in Virginia. So Southerners are all of a sudden are like, well, see what all this abolitionist rhetoric is doing? It's actually causing people to rise up and violently. So they're feeling more and more persecuted in this period as this militant abolitionism is growing. You see black abolitionists themselves doing things without, needing the help of white abolitionists sometimes. Sometimes they work with them, sometimes not. So you see a number of black anti-slavery societies, particularly in the 1830s, 1840s. Frederick Douglass, for example, is going to become one of the more prominent figures after publication of his autobiography in the 1840s. He works for a time with Garrison, but later they would kind of go their own separate ways a bit too, over various things. But it's interesting that both black and white abolitionists sometimes choose to work together towards the same goal, but sometimes see things differently. And it is not true that all white abolitionists were free of racism either. It was possible for certain folks to be abolitionists, to be in favor of ending the institution of slavery, but still be racist. Why do you think that's the case? Why would that be the case? You would think, if you're a white abolitionist in this period, that you would be sort of free of racism. Why do you think that may not be the case for certain abolitionists to still have some problems around issues of race? White abolitionists. That's an interesting question too. Some black abolitionists that might have internalized some views of African Americans as well. That's interesting. I hadn't thought of that. But why might someone be abolitionist but not be in favor of racial equality? That's a better way to ask it.
Is it the imagined community that you're not?
Okay.
You're treated well, but you cannot. I do not value.
Okay.
I don't have to value.
That's good. They don't see them perhaps as that close a member of their community. Okay, maybe slavery is wrong, but I still don't want them living next door, kind of thing, right? You still sort of see these things maybe even today. Okay, maybe they shouldn't be victims of police brutality, but we don't want them living in our neighborhood, kind of thing. It can be a cycle in that sense. Maybe they buy into a lot of these images. Think about the Ethnic Notions video, right? The images of the Sambo and the Coon and the Mammy and Jezebel. A lot of folks are seeing and internalizing those images. So even if they say, okay, maybe they shouldn't be held in slavery, but they still aren't quite like me. Right? And so that concept of imagined community may still work and help us to understand this. That might be one reason, kind of cultural stereotypes.
I know someone who was married to a white guy, and every time they fight, the guy would call her bloody monkey.
Ooh.
Wow.
I can't even get into that.
Wow.
Bring him to class. We'll turn our lights off. No, say that. But that's a problem. So you think that he'd overcome something because of the fact that they, fell in love, got married, but there's still some issues there, obviously. As trash. Okay. I'm still stuck on that, especially from husband and wife. You're supposed to be connected and equal, but my whole head just exploded. I apologize. So yeah, the cultural part of it might be one. I'll give you another one. Northern factory owner. A number of northern industrialists and factory owners will join abolitionist movements, in part for economic reasons. You own a textile factory in Massachusetts, you might say, well, wait a second, if they got free labor down there and I got to pay my workers here, how can I compete with that? Right? Or some other type of business. A lot of folks would argue against slavery for economic reasons. So in some ways it didn't have anything to do with believing in racial equality. It was all about their own economic interests. Or some believe that slaves are just dangerous, that eventually that Nat Turner thing was really going to jump off. We better get rid of it while we can. Right? Remember Thomas Jefferson's quote about slavery is like holding a wolf by the ears. Right? So you don't want to really hold a wolf by the ears and deal with all that, but you also don't want to let it go. Right? So he says at that point you're kind of in a dilemma. What do you do? So again, there might be a lot of reasons why someone might be abolitionist but not necessarily believe in racial equality. And maybe the opposite. Well, I won't say the opposite can't be true. No, I'm going to leave that at that.
It's such like first psychological thing. So it's just like they release the body, but they want to control the mind.
Want to control the mind. In many ways, controlling the mind might be seen as even more important.
So yeah, we freed everybody. We broke up this Declaration of Independence and all that other good stuff. But at the same time, we keep feeding the Sambo and the Sitcom, and we keep feeding. And eventually we just keep destroying the families this way. Because we really don't like when we did have freedom.
I say that's going to continue even after slavery's over.
So it's a cycle. So nobody will never say stop.
Maybe you might have to be even more radical to really go beyond just getting rid of slavery, but to really argue in favor of true emancipation, true freedom, right? True equality. That's most people couldn't even imagine that. Even many abolitionists said, okay, let's free them. Like Abraham Lincoln said, okay, well, we should get rid of slavery, but we should send them all somewhere. They can't live here. They just didn't believe that there could be a society, a nation of sort of black and white, right? That multiracial nation. Now, of course, this nation has always been that since folks came here, right? But they still couldn't wrap their mind around that fact. So it should be Native Americans like, hey, hold on a second. You guys, speaking of the table, like you guys pulled up a chair at our table, and now we can't be there. Right? So yeah, I mean, this notion of inequality has really been sort of central from the beginning, as we've seen in different ways. Now again, freeing one's mind is interesting too in terms of this next example. Many male abolitionists, right, are going to have problems with women abolitionists. A number of women will involve themselves in the abolitionist movement. Black women, you saw Mariah Stewart, for example, but also white women. A number of white women find themselves heavily involved in abolitionism, and this sort of opens up something in many of them that says, well, wait a second. We're arguing for abolition and citizenship rights for African Americans, yet women don't have those rights. They have freedom, but they don't have citizenship rights. They can't vote, own property, these sorts of things. So many people see this as really the beginning of a feminist movement in the 1840s as well. Right? You get Seneca Falls in 1848 with people like Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, those folks. A lot of them are former abolitionists. Yet many of the men in the abolitionist movement say, oh, well, hold on, right? Women in these movements is not enough, right? Women speaking to mixed audiences was seen as particularly radical. A lot of folks were taken aback even by that. So it's interesting how, freeing one's mind sometimes seems like it takes forever to sort of get there. And so this abolitionist movement is going to be complicated. Some people would define both and really define both. Think about a Sojourner Truth, right? She's sort of famous for her standing up to this abolitionist meeting, this feminist context, and making the claim about, aren't I a woman? Right? She had been involved in abolition. She's also going to be heavily involved in the feminist struggle and sort of holds herself up as an example. She was a former slave. She worked in the fields. She makes the case that she could do as much field work as any man, yet she was still female. So really complicating these sort of assumptions about gender and race all at the same time. And a number of folks are going to have to take these things into account. A number of journals will be published, including some of the earliest ones. Frederick Douglass, for example, involved in the North Star, Freedom Journal, these early black papers. Many of them are going to take up abolition as their first cause, their first goal. You might understand that might seem the most important, most pressing problem, right? Deal with that first. Get rid of the institution of slavery, then you can deal with all these other issues. They'll continue to do so. Mary Ann Shadd Cary is an African-American woman, again, pushing for not only freedom, but also immigration. She herself would push for immigration to Canada. Some people are believing, look, we're never going to get equality here. Maybe we should look elsewhere, either to the Caribbean or back to Africa or to Canada. And she herself is going to spend tremendous time looking northward, that maybe freedom is north, beyond America's borders. Many connected to religion, right? If you call yourself a Christian nation, right, would Jesus want slavery? Right? Is this universal brotherhood, the brotherhood that he put out there? So a lot of folks that really took their religion seriously would be drawn towards anti-slavery movements, but not everyone. Not everyone. Again, they're going to argue that it's contrary to what Jesus taught about do unto others as you want them to do unto you, so on and so forth. Again, there are a number of abolitionist arguments. We've already laid out many of them here. Some of them might be as simple as economics. Some of them might be sort of true ideas of freedom and equality. This colonization question, again, is one we raised before, particularly from the perspective of African Americans. There's a choice that's going to be made. Do you feel like you should stay in the United States? In part because maybe your ancestors, by this point, have been here for 200 years. Or do you say, you know what, we'll never have freedom here, let's leave, let's go somewhere, anywhere but here, right? And there are some that are going to leave. Most decide to stay because they felt like this was their country. Because they felt like, if anything, they had earned it and deserved it more than their slave owners. They had been the ones literally working the land. So to leave for many felt like abandoning all that they had gained. Right? All of a sudden, you're going to push for freedom, and what happens when you get free? You're going to leave? Right? What about that 200 years of back pay? Right? So for some, it's really an interesting choice, and I think it does, once again, raise questions of imagined community. Right? They feel like this nation is theirs, is ours, in that sense. You'll see a number of folks pushing in different directions in this period. Go through some of this stuff. Arthur Tappan, Weld, Garrison are all prominent white abolitionists, particularly in places like Boston, Massachusetts, and in New York. Again, these are becoming sort of bastions of the abolitionist movement. Not that there was complete equality or anything in the North either. And often Southerners will hold this up and say, well, wait a second, you guys discriminated against African Americans in the North. How are you then going to come down here and tell us in the South about our quote-unquote backward civilization and how slavery is retarding the growth of the nation and these sorts of things when you don't give people equality, you don't give free blacks even full equality. So a lot of times Southerners are going to hold up this mirror to the North and point out their hypocrisy around issues of race as well. What does the pro-slavery argument look like? Now, again, we've already seen some of this in the whole ethnic notions, right? Remember, this pro-slavery argument is developing more than ever before in the antebellum period, in part because pro-slavery Southerners are feeling so defensive that the abolitionists' attack are picking up force, and so folks start to defend themselves. They start making arguments like, well, slavery is really a good thing. Right? It helps these folks, and this is why the Sambo and the Coon do such important political work, right? Because they really are justifying a system. These folks need to be taken care of. They're like children. Right? Well, look what will happen to them if they're just let free. Right? They become coons, they become violent, they become rapists. Right? This is sort of the stereotype that develops after the Civil War, is that especially black men are suddenly rapists. Frederick Douglass and others are going to say, well, wait a second, why weren't they raping everybody during the Civil War when all the Southern men were gone? Right? If it was biologically true that black men were rapists, there would have been a whole lot of raping going on during the Civil War, and there wasn't. Right? So in many ways, people are going to have to deconstruct these stereotypes as they're developing and changing. But this pro-slavery argument in this period, I say is really a defensive mechanism trying to maintain this institution. So they promote the idea that slavery was a positive good. It supposedly did things like bring Christianity to these African, heathens, essentially. Right? It's going to teach them the work ethic, teach them how to work. Otherwise, they'd be lazy Sambos. Right? It's going to, clean up these Jezebel women. I mean, all these supposed positives that come out of it. On top of it, making the nation wealthy. Right? So it's interesting to see some of these arguments that develop. See some of the main arguments here: the need for labor. This notion that people are biologically, mentally inferior, almost like children, or, like it says here, a different species, almost like animals. Right? And if you were to free them, that they would, almost like the Darwinism that's going to develop in this period, they're going to die out. They can't survive without the help of a more civilized or superior group of people. Right? So a lot of these ideas are developing together. Anti-slavery rhetoric is prohibited in the South. You can get arrested for having a copy of David Walker's Appeal, for example. This is the idea that you have to defend the entire region from the ideas of abolition, because if those ideas were to fall into the wrong hands, meaning the slaves, that it could be deadly, and it is going to be deadly. Right? Nat Turner kills up about 60 people before he stopped. Or people maybe even scarier than Nat Turner might be a John Brown. John Brown in 1859 is a white guy. Right? He gets his sons, some runaway slaves, some free blacks, and they attack the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry. They attack the federal arsenal. Their plan is to get all the guns from that arsenal, take these guns, deliver them to the slaves in Virginia, and end slavery that way. Essentially start a civil war. Right? That had to terrify pro-slavery Southerners, because maybe you can imagine slaves being unhappy about being slaves. But this guy from Kansas, this white guy, is going to come down here and risk his life? Right? This freaks out a lot of people. A lot of folks see this as one of the events kicking off the Civil War, in fact, because suddenly these white Northerners had gone this far. They're willing to attack us. That's how the pro-slavery South is going to start to see it. Get conflict between abolitionists and pro-slavery folks. This is really becoming a northern versus southern kind of thing as well, a regional debate, again, leading us closer and closer to Civil War. Many of the debates over Western expansion are going to involve questions of slavery. Right? Every time a new state comes in, and you see this in the videos and in the chapter, but every time a new state comes in, it has to be decided, is it going to be slavery-free? Is it going to be slavery-free? And that question is a very significant one. Abolitionists frequently are the target of violence. particularly white abolitionists. Several of them are going to be killed. A guy named Elijah Lovejoy is killed in Illinois, right? Not in Mississippi, in Illinois. He's killed because of his abolitionist views. In 1836, Southern congressional leaders adopted a rule to table all petitions against slavery, called the gag rule. Basically, they said, you know what? It's too controversial even to discuss in Congress ending slavery. We don't even want to bring it up. Right? This is how bitter the partisanship and the regionalism has become. They say we shouldn't even talk about it. Right? And so this gag rule is going to be put into place. It's sort of showing you already the tensions that are growing as early as the 1830s. They're only going to get worse. It backfires. Right? By the late 1840s, Northern whites will begin to see slavery as a threat to their own liberty for whatever reason, whether it's slave states expanding and then coming to dominate Congress, whether it's the economic threat of slavery for Northern industry, whether it's racial views, right? They're seeing slavery as a problem more and more in the North. Now, that doesn't mean that they're in favor of racial equality, but it does mean that many of them are starting to see the expansion of slavery as a problem. 1850s, political opponents of slavery will begin to win elections. You can start to see that it's becoming more and more popular to maybe come out against slavery, or at least the expansion of slavery outside of the southern states. Right? That's what Lincoln was about. He says, I'm not going to stop it in the South, but I don't want it spreading any further. Southerners view that as he's trying to end our tradition, our institution of slavery. So both of them are nervous. Some of the counter arguments might include notions of equality. Frederick Douglass obviously is one of the most prominent figures, prominent intellectuals of his time. Beginning in 1845, he really is going to be one of the most important African American leaders for the next 50 years. He doesn't pass until 1895, in fact, here in D.C. So it's a long, sort of illustrious, distinguished career for this former slave who runs away and remakes himself. We've talked about the significance of slave narratives, how really writing this text is not just about writing a story, it's about abolition. These texts were written for abolitionist purposes and really to prove the necessity of freedom. Underground Railroad. We've talked quite a bit, or we haven't talked quite a bit, but you've heard quite a bit about the Underground Railroad, this notion of a pathway to help people escape from slavery in the South to the North, and perhaps even to Canada, especially after 1850, when things like the Fugitive Slave Act make it more and more difficult to hold on to your freedom, even in the North. So this Underground Railroad is going to guide people out. It's not a literal train, right? Although some are going to hop on trains and use trains, especially if you were literate and could write your own paths, you might be able to get away with that. But for the most part, it's a figurative sort of thing, a pathway to freedom. It starts as a network of anti-slavery activists, people that are willing to put their own freedom on the line to help someone else. General Thomas Booth, for example, refused to give the mother of his slave, Stephen, back to her mistress. So you're getting Northerners, for whatever reason, starting to intervene. Right? Southerners are saying, this is our property. Look, they run away, we can go get them. And after 1850, the Fugitive Slave Act says they can go into the North and get their property, even though the North is free territory. This is causing tremendous conflict. Property rights. Americans value property rights. What if that property, though, is human beings? This is when the things start to butt up against each other. And you see a number of these moments happen in the video, for example. They talk about 1854, I think it was, in Boston. A runaway slave is captured on the streets of Boston. The heart of abolition. Right? And they're going to take him back to the South and give him back to his master. A bunch of abolitionists come out and say, no, that's not happening. Right? And you sort of see the conflict that develops in that. Essentially, they call out the army. An army regiment has to go in to get this one guy, put him on a ship, bring him back to the South and return him to slavery. There's almost civil war, essentially. And think about the cost, a whole army regiment to get one guy. Right? But abolitionists in Boston are saying, wait a second, how can pro-slavery forces come into the heart of, sort of free territory and re-enslave somebody? Right? They sort of question their own identity in certain ways. Again, the number of slaves reaching freedom via the Underground Railroad is unknown. We'll never know the full total amount. Some of the stories here are sort of fantastic stories of the Underground Railroad, people with hidden compartments in their house or floors that the door walls opened up. Somebody comes knocking in the middle of the night, you essentially put them in there, right? Wait till the slave catchers pass, or wait till it was safe for them to proceed on to the next kind of safe house. This is generally how the Underground Railroad worked. Free blacks would be involved in it, many whites that are involved in it, particularly in border states, right? So if you could get, say, from Kentucky to Ohio, right, you literally could get into freedom by crossing the river, right? But then you still needed some help, otherwise you could be recaptured and returned to slavery. Again, this is going to intensify the resentment of slaveholders toward the North. They feel like the North is their enemy. Right? They feel like the North is really a kind of separate nation, a whole separate imagined community. So when we start to think about how a civil war is going to be possible, I think it starts there, right? It starts by looking at this other region as being your enemy, as being, looking at wanting to destroy you, essentially. There's some maps on the Underground Railroad and how it might work from various places in the 19th century. Most operations take place at night. It was safer to travel at night. For example, under cover of darkness, slaves might prepare by taking supplies. So you might steal a little something here or there, pack some food, right? Because you know you're going to be on a journey that might take some time. Right? You're probably going on foot, at least for large parts of this. Slaves, early days, disguising themselves. There are some really interesting stories about slaves disguising themselves. Maybe the most famous one would be William and Ellen Craft, husband and wife who run away together. And Ellen Craft dresses up as a man. Very light-skinned. She dresses up essentially to pass as a white man. And then her husband is posing as her slave. And they use this to get north. Think about it, so the audacity of that, first of all, but it works. Another famous strategy for freedom might be Henry Box Brown. You've ever heard of Henry Box Brown? Bless you. Henry Box Brown mails himself north. Gets a big crate, pokes some air holes in it, gets himself sealed up in there, and literally mails himself north. And it works. These abolitionists open it up, and he hops out like, "What's up?" Think about these strategies used when people are, pursuing their freedom. They're willing to go to tremendous lengths to do so. And again, in the early days, you'd have to mostly go on foot. As it grows, there might be wagons, there might be ships you could hop on, trains, carriages, other ways to make the trip more quickly. But that's always dangerous. When you're coming in contact with people, then there's the possibility of recapture, especially once your name and face get out there in newspapers and these sorts of things. But you want to head to freedom. You want to head north. Eventually, freedom might have to be Canada, though, because even in the north, you might not be completely safe.
I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
Was there like after slavery was abolished, what happened to all the crops and stuff like that? Was there like a demands in like
who's going to do the work, basically?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, in the South, this becomes an issue. For the most part, cotton is still going to be the crop, and most African Americans are still in the South well into the 20th century, and so they're still largely doing that work. But now they're often sharecroppers, or they're tied to the land in some other way. There's going to be a whole series of mechanisms used almost to sort of re-enslave people legally. Sharecropping is one way to do that. But yeah, they really are going to mostly stay in that type of work for generations. To this day, some folks talk about sharecropping in some pretty bad situations to this day. But yeah, you're right. And it's interesting because there are going to be various mechanisms used to control that labor. Even the 1890s and early 1900s and World War I, folks start to leave the South in larger numbers. The whole Great Migration is going to happen. 6 million African Americans are going to leave the South between 1910 and 1970. They're going to say enough is enough. They're going to head north, especially once the wars begin and there are jobs in the north. But what happens? Folks try to stop them. All of a sudden, men with guns are at the train station like, no, you're not leaving. Right? Despite things like lynching, right, that seems to be chasing people out of the South, you have these people saying, no, we need the labor, so you can't leave. Right? So it's interesting. They sort of hate their presence there, but they also know they need their labor. Who else is going to do that work? Right now, we're going to see other ways that work might get done, particularly regionally. Think about the West. Mexican Americans, Latinos of various types are going to be doing that work, and many still do. Asian labor, Chinese laborers begin coming to California in the 1850s, doing some of the most dirty and dangerous work, building railroads and, in agriculture. Chinese and Japanese laborers and Mexican Americans in particular in the West are going to be largely responsible for that. So there's always been this kind of racial component to the most difficult, dangerous, dirtiest jobs. And that's, some people say a lot of that continues to this day in some of the debates around immigration, for example. You need the labor, but do you really want folks to have citizenship rights? That's when folks, I think, stumble in certain ways. Harriet Tubman. Harriet Tubman's a good topic, right? Pretty soon we're going to have some Tubmans in our pocket. Right? We're on the money now. Really interesting, important figure in terms of freedom. Right? Using money from her work as a domestic servant, she left the North 14 times to bring family and other slaves to freedom. Starting herself in Maryland as a slave. Right? She's going to free herself, and then she's going to think about imagined community. She's going to go back and keep getting other folks. First, she gets family members. Ultimately, she's going to get somewhere like 300 people freed. She had specific tactics. They talk about Harriet Tubman. She would come into the neighborhood, basically. She would come within 8 to 10 miles of the plantation and say, look, if you're really serious, you meet me at such and such. I'm not coming to your house and knocking on your door. She wanted to make sure you were serious about going. She didn't want you turning back halfway, talking about it's cold and stuff. And in fact, Harriet Tubman carried a pistol. And she was prepared to shoot anybody that wanted to turn around, because if you wanted to turn around, you might tell. She never had to do that, but she was fully prepared to put a cap in somebody if need be in order to avoid recapture. She never lost any cargo. She also would work as a spy during the Civil War. Harriet Tubman is one of these magnificent figures. She gets a $20 Civil War pension 30 years later, 30 years after the Civil War. She, I think, paid $20 for her mother's freedom, or her father paid $20 for her mother's freedom, something like that. So a lot of people were talking about the significance of the 20, right, what she's about to be on in her own life. But it's still an ongoing debate too in terms of Harriet Tubman. I look forward though to her replacing Andrew Jackson on the $20 bill. I think she represents a lot of positives that should be held up in American society. Again, after fugitive slave laws are passed, she preferred bringing slaves all the way to Canada, because that really was the only way she could ensure their freedom. Because if you could be recaptured there's a picture of her, if you could be recaptured in the North, she didn't want to take folks all the way there just to have them stolen back south. If any of you have seen 12 Years a Slave, right? He gets taken from New York, right? Goes through D.C. and ends up in slavery. All of this is leading the nation to civil war. We're moving closer and closer to civil war in this case. Now, many will say that the Civil War is not about slavery. You can make a number of arguments about the causes of the Civil War. I want you to actually think about the causes of the Civil War. I would argue that many of them have to do with slavery. Whether it's Western expansion, well, that involves slavery because all these new states are going to be slavery-free. And answering that question means who's going to be in charge, who's going to have the most political power in Congress. Is it about economics? Well, obviously, slavery is the most profitable economic system in the nation at the time. So a lot of these arguments at least indirectly relate to slavery, if not directly. The Compromise of 1850. Compromise of 1850 is the compromise having to do with expansion and new states being added to the Union. In this case, California. California comes in 1850 as a free state. Again, this is another interesting point. California comes in as a free state not because they were in favor of racial equality, but they did not want to open up California to slave competition. Think about California in 1850. It's about a year and a half after the discovery of gold. They don't want folks bringing a bunch of slaves in there to mine these things and keep all the money. So a lot of it had to do with economics, not just sort of racial equality in this sense. What they do is California enters as a free state, and the South says, well, wait a second, if we're going to let them have this huge new free state, what are we going to get as pro-slavery states? And so they're given certain things as a part of the compromise. One of them is a new Fugitive Slave Act that says you can go get your property anywhere in the nation with the help of local constables or the army. So a number of things come out of this compromise. The slave trade is outlawed in D.C. It's important in the nation's capital. Some people see that as too big a contradiction to come to the sort of capital of freedom and see slaves being auctioned off. Right? So this compromise is going to be big, but it's really a tipping point. The 1850s are a tipping point towards war. And you'll see how many key events happen in the 1850s here that are going to move us closer and closer to war. Again, under the new Fugitive Slave Act, owners of escaped slaves could pursue them and get them back, intensify these manhunts. Many slaves were returned. Others are afraid of being captured. Right? You're walking down the street looking over your shoulder thinking that this guy is looking at you, it might be a slave trader. It really makes everybody insecure in this sense. Then Uncle Tom's Cabin is published in 1852. Abolitionist text. Uncle Tom's Cabin is written by Harriet Beecher Stowe, a white woman abolitionist. She writes this story in order to outline the horrors of slavery. This character, Uncle Tom, who's this very forgiving figure in a sense. He's one of the main characters, obviously, but really one of the main characters is Simon Legree, a slave trader, who she paints sort of horrible picture of him. They talk about the abuse of slaves and whatnot, and it becomes a bestseller. In 1852, she sells, I think, 300,000 copies the first year, 3 million copies over several years. It was the second best-selling book, only to the Bible in this period. So you're seeing how intense these feelings are becoming, how popular abolitionist ideas are becoming. When Abraham Lincoln gets to meet Harriet Beecher Stowe years later, he says, "I want to meet the woman that started the Civil War." That's how significant he thought the book was. He sort of puts that on her. The Kansas-Nebraska Act. The Kansas-Nebraska Act in some ways says repeals or circumvents the Missouri Compromise of 1820. Initially, the Missouri Compromise set a line that said that nothing north of that line, north of Missouri, could be slave state. So the north was going to be free and the rest of the south is going to be slave. This Kansas-Nebraska Act is going to challenge much of this. You see this in the last part of the Africans in America video, where the idea of popular sovereignty is put in place. What does popular sovereignty mean? Well, kind of what it sounds like. Basically, you would vote. The members of the state would vote whether their state, when it's coming into the Union, should be slave or free. So if there's 100,000 people in California in 1850, they would take a vote. Do you want to be a slave or a free state? If 51,000 vote for a free state, then you're a free state. For many, this seems like the best way to deal with these sort of expansion tensions, these sectional tensions that are growing, because it feels like democracy, that people are deciding for themselves whether they want to be a slave or a free state. But it's going to lead to problems in various places, including in Kansas, right? Northerners and Southerners are going to struggle over a place like Kansas. What you have when Kansas is coming up for statehood is you have thousands of people from different states flooding into Kansas. You have pro-slavery forces coming into Kansas, like, okay, if we can get our numbers up, we can make it a slave state. You have abolitionist folks coming in, free state folks, more specifically, flooding into Kansas. And they say, if we can get our numbers up, we can make it a free state. This is going to lead to violence in Kansas. In fact, John Brown, who we mentioned a second ago, first is involved in what they call bleeding Kansas. Him and his sons kill up some guys, some pro-slavery guys in Kansas. Right? So he was serious about this whole abolition thing, including killing and eventually giving his own life. He eventually is going to be executed himself, John Brown is. So Kansas, some see this as kind of a dress rehearsal for the Civil War. Literally, people are dying over this idea of slave versus free state. Dred Scott. Bleeding Kansas is 1856. The Dred Scott decision is 1857. Anybody know who Dred Scott was and what this case was about? Heard that name before. Dred Scott was a slave whose owner takes him north into free territory. I think he goes into Minnesota territory for a while. So Dred Scott's sitting down and saying, well, wait a second. If I was a slave in, say, Missouri, but I go into Minnesota where they don't have slavery, I can't possibly be a slave. How can you be a slave in a place that doesn't have slavery? So he sues. Him and his wife say, okay, I'm no longer a slave because I'm living in this free territory for 10 years now. He's going to lose his case. But he does take his case, and it goes all the way up to the Supreme Court. But the decision is an important one in 1857. What the Supreme Court says is not only does Dred Scott lose his case and need to be returned to slavery, that would have been bad enough, but the court goes a step further and says, you know what, he doesn't even have the right to bring a case here because Africans are not really people. They're not citizens. Technically, or specifically, the quote from Justice Roger Taney was, they have no rights that a white man is bound to respect. No rights that a white man is bound to respect. So abolitionists and African Americans obviously are up in arms about this. Not only has he lost his case, but it really is the entire dehumanization of all African Americans, slave and free, in 1857. This is what really pushes a lot of folks to the brink and thinking that civil war may be the only way to deal with these issues, right? So he's accompanied his master to a free state. He tries to take advantage of that loophole, and it does not work. He's not a citizen and cannot bring a suit into court. This is an illustration of Dred Scott and his wife. Again, abolitionists are going to pick up on this case. John Brown's raid, we mentioned that. Sort of end with John Brown in 1859 decides he's going to end slavery himself through force of arms. He says, okay, court says they're not human. I had another idea. Plans this raid. He actually asked Frederick Douglass to accompany him on his raid, and Frederick Douglass like, man, that's not going to work. You're crazy. Frederick Douglass like, thank you, but no thank you. He says, look, if you attack Harper's Ferry, you're going to bring down the entire federal government and the army on you. John Brown said, I don't care. John Brown said that God told him to end slavery. He said that God told him to break the jawbone of slaveholders. That was his literal quote. His sons are involved in it and invested in it. There are a number of free African Americans that are invested in it and a number of runaway slaves. About 20 of them in total will attack Harper's Ferry. And they're doing okay for a while, but then they get pinned down by the army, by a major by the name of Robert E. Lee. Robert E. Lee, later an important general on the Civil War Confederate side. And they're going to get captured. Many of them are killed. John Brown gets wounded, and he's going to be sentenced to death. He would ride on his own casket to the gallows, right? So he's sort of sitting on his casket as they carry him to go be hanged. And he basically, says, whatever. He didn't seem to be concerned with it at all. And he is going to be hung. Again, Southerners look at this as, wait a second, this is the extreme to which the North is willing to go to in 1859. 1860, Abraham Lincoln is elected President of the United States. Many Southerners see this as the final straw of this sort of upstart Republican Party. Lincoln has sort of promised to limit slavery. He doesn't say he's going to abolish it. He says he's going to limit it to the South, but many feel like that's it. We are so divided as a nation by this point that Lincoln doesn't even appear on the ballot in most Southern states. Doesn't even appear to be a candidate there, but he's still going to win, in part because of the population numbers in the North and the power of the North. Southerners feel persecuted by this, and this is going to lead to the secession of first South Carolina and then other states in the Union. They will fire on Fort Sumter, South Carolina, and this is going to be the Civil War, the beginning of the Civil War. Obviously, 4 years later, 620,000 deaths later, we have the abolition of slavery, and the North is going to obviously win that war, thankfully ending slavery and sort of bringing this to a close.